Well, polls are starting to close in Canada, where a snap election is being held to determine who will become the country's next Prime Minister. And it comes, as you know, just 6 weeks after Mark Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister, replacing his party colleague Justin Trudeau. The two clear front-runners are the Liberal Party, led by Mark Carney, which has been in power for a decade, and the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre. Now, the first projection of the evening is out, but before that, let's take a quick look at the big headlines. First, polls close across Canada. The polls close in Newfoundland and Labrador provinces. Early results indicate that Liberals are gaining and leading the first seat as per the projections. Reports, meanwhile, state that the US President Donald Trump is to soften auto tariffs. In fact, reports further add that Trump is to relieve tariffs on foreign parts. This as the shadow of tariffs looms large over the polls in Canada. Meanwhile, as we keenly watch all the election results, Canada Election Authority website is currently down. The website issues a delay release of poll results. Well, polls are starting to close in Canada, where a snap election is being held to determine who will actually become the country's next Prime Minister. This, as Donald Trump in their neighborhood has caused quite the havoc with the tariffs. It also comes just weeks after Mark Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister, replacing his party colleague Justin Trudeau. And the two clear frontrunners, as I mentioned, are the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, the Liberals being led by Mark Carney, which has been in power for a decade, and the Conservative Party, meanwhile, led by Pierre Poilievre. The first projection is out from Canada's public broadcaster, CBC. It has gone to the Liberals. In fact, Philip Earle is projected to hold his riding in Labrador. Of course, there are still 342 seats left to tabulate, so stick with us as we keep a close eye on all the developments right here on NDTV. In fact, you know Canada's approach to Donald Trump to their south has been a mix of carrot, which is offering to negotiate a new trade deal, and stick, which is actually countering the tariffs. And Canada has already imposed roughly $65 billion worth in response to current American levies. To take a quick stock of the situation on how Washington is seeing the current events unfold, we've got Nick Harper joining us live at the moment. Nick, always a pleasure to see you on NDTV. Now, from Washington's lens, is there worry that a divided Canada could weaken the North American alliance at a time of global instability?
Well, I think from Donald Trump's point of view, he's happy for that chaos to be there. Indeed, he has been really the one that's been sowing that chaos. The Trump effect is very much at play in these Canadian elections. I think it's worth bearing in mind that Justin Trudeau, when he stepped down in January, was seen as a very unpopular leader. And after 10 years of leading the Liberals in Canada, the thinking was, and the polling suggested, that there was no way the Liberal Party could return to power. Of course, we've seen a complete 180 over the course of the last 3 months, largely because of Donald Trump and his trade policies. Mark Carney, trailing badly by double digits to the Conservative Party, has turned that around, and going into Election Day was up by about 3 percentage points. Donald Trump's tariffs has certainly caused lots of division within Canada, and I think that's why we've seen both parties really trying to unite Canadians, saying that Donald Trump is there trying to divide the nation, with talk of Canada becoming America's 51st state. We even heard from Mark Carney over the weekend, in the last day or so, ahead of polls closing, saying that Donald Trump was trying to break us, Canadians, so America can own us. And he said that he was the man to try and unite the country. And really, it's all about which person Canadians feel can better stand up to Donald Trump at a time when that alliance between the two North American countries is very much under threat.
Also, Nick, how much does Trump's administration actually prefer Mark Carney to win over friendly Pierre Poilievre?
Well, I think in some respects they would have preferred Pierre Poilievre to be doing much better in the polls ahead of Election Day. He holds similar values to the Republican Party here in the US. The Conservative Party in Canada have that more right-minded thinking as opposed to the Liberal, more left-leaning party of Mark Carney. And therefore there would have been, I guess, some similarity between those two parties, between the Conservatives in Canada and the Republicans here in the United States. And in some respects, I suppose Donald Trump would be more worried about Mark Carney being the man in charge of the country after this election, as he is the one that has been much more of the firebrand politician over the last few weeks, being much stronger in his language about trying to stand up to the United States, really trying to push back with reciprocal tariffs being put in place by Canada on the United States as a result of Donald Trump's initial trade policies. So I think if Mark Carney continues to lead the country, if he wins this election, giving the Liberals another stint in power, that would be of more concern to Donald Trump as opposed to the Conservatives winning this evening.
Well, Nick, do stay on with us as we quickly get in an update from Canada at the moment. Michael's joining us live as well. Michael, tell us what's happening at the moment. We believe that you have some latest updates for us straight from Canada.
Yes, we do. Well, the East Coast has started to close, so the Conservatives have 11 seats and the Liberals have 21. I would concur with a lot that Nick had to say. I will say that I think Mark Carney ran a campaign that was based on fear of Donald Trump. What Pierre Poilievre ran a campaign on was that we need to stop the bleeding. 3 terms is more than enough. The deficit of $2.3 trillion is more than enough. It's time for change. And I would also add that I think the way that Pierre Poilievre would deal with Donald Trump and the tariffs is that 0 is 0. You have 0 percentage of tariffs on Canada and 0 percentage on the United States, and we would be one of the largest and most powerful trading blocs in the world, where I would say that Carney wants to be more antagonistic. So it'll be very interesting to see, as Nick pointed out, the 20-point differentiation that initially was how the election was set up with Poilievre in the lead. Then Trudeau went out of the way, Carney came in, and then it was all about Trump, Trump, Trump. So I think Trump derangement syndrome had an effect, but we'll see if, just like the first term with Donald Trump, where Hillary had the hats printed, the fireworks were ready to go, and she lost the election. And people said, oh my goodness, this could be the same turnout. I'm hoping that that will be the result for Canada tonight.
Right, Michael. Also, would you say that Mark Carney successfully reframed this election as a referendum on resisting Trump? Or is this a narrative only echoing among the elites in Canada?
Yes, I think it is among the elites in Canada. Canada has a problem, and we have a $2.3 trillion deficit. We're operating on $46 billion a year that we are over budget, and nobody's addressing that. We had a problem with immigration, with student immigration. There's certain areas that have to be honored and respected. And what Pierre Poilievre is bringing back is some semblance of order. Canada, for instance, under the Trudeau regime, put so much money to foreign aid and to things that were more DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to certain things which seem to be more political than having any aid. And Canadians are looking at that amount of money and saying it's time to bring that money home. We have homeless people on the streets. We have students who are graduating, foreign students that are graduating that need help. And the Canadian taxpayer is overburdened. Things are too expensive. Vegetables, everything is expensive. And I think what Poilievre wants to bring is some semblance of respect for a budget and bring the country back again. Unfortunately, Carney, from my perspective, is all about spend. It's all about if you're in deficit, you spend more because you're going to get out of deficit. I don't know what kitchen table he works at. But if I'm over budget at the end of the month, I've got to cut something, not just add more deficit. And again, without being repetitive, I hope the Canadian people can see some clarity of fiscal responsibility. And after 3 terms since 2015 with Justin Trudeau, it's time for a change.
Right. In fact, Nick, I want to bring you in on this. Michael mentioned immigration. It has emerged as one of the key issues. Nick, is the Indian American community in Washington and in the US also watching Canada's election closely, given the shared concerns over immigration and sovereignty?
I mean, I'm sure they will be. Immigration has moved to the forefront here in the United States as a real driving force, a real motivating force for Americans. Of course, we saw Donald Trump win last year's election really because he pushed that immigration message very hard, saying that the previous Biden administration, the Democratic administration, had simply let too many illegal migrants into the United States. I guess what we've also seen from Donald Trump, now that he is within the Oval Office once again, is pushing on immigration as being an issue not just for the southern border that the US shares with Mexico, but also on its northern border that it shares with Canada. His original explanation as to why he was imposing tariffs on the US's two nearest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, was all down, he said, to immigration, the problem of too many illegal migrants crossing both borders, the south and the north, but also letting in illegal drugs, fentanyl, into the United States. And he tried to work with both governments to try and put into place measures that would create tougher border restrictions. We saw both the Mexican and the Canadian government respond in kind with that, partly because they wanted to try and offset those tariffs that they were suddenly hit with, to do something that could be seen as a deal from Donald Trump's point of view. The Indian American community, it is a big issue for them. It is one that they closely followed during last year's US election, and undoubtedly they will be watching all of this unfold. They'll have been watching over the border to see how immigration has been playing out on voters' minds and in the polling ahead of Election Day itself.
Right. Nick, before I let you go, is Washington also seeing Canada's election as a test case for whether democracies can actually resist the strongman politics trend?
Well, potentially, yes. I mean, Donald Trump has radicalized the way that he has done business with other countries in the last almost 100 days since he's been in office. He has disrupted not just domestic politics here in the US, but globally, the way that alliances have been forged, and really rattled some of America's closest allies and, of course, neighbors. He has disrupted the election process in another country, in Canada, just by putting in practices and policies that were not expected. The fact that it has so completely turned around the Canadian election in such a short space of time, I think is testament to Donald Trump's power as a disruptor. Whether that's good or for bad, of course, depends on which side of the political aisle you are on here in the United States. But Republicans have been cheering what they've seen from Donald Trump during these last 100 days. And they feel by putting in trade policies, by putting in tariffs against other countries, it is Donald Trump's way of rebalancing that unfair playing field as they see it. The fact that there are trade deficits with other countries. I think it'll be very interesting to see how these election results play out in Canada, really to give us some sense of whether Donald Trump's power and influence transcends borders, transcends the United States, and whether ultimately he's able to put a very firm stamp on the Canadian election.
As always, Nick, thanks so much for joining us with the latest. Also joining us, I'm told, Vikram Chaudhary, live from Brampton at the moment. Vikram, thanks so much for your time. I know it's been quite a busy few hours for you, but with such a large Indian origin population in Brampton where you are, how invested are voters in issues like Canada's sovereignty and Trump's annexation threats?
Absolutely. If you talk about December 2024, the issues were different. It was more of the economy, more of unemployment, immigration. But all of a sudden, when Donald Trump came to power and his tariff threats, that's when the entire country united. And as Nick was pointing it out, it was more than anything else. I think Donald Trump had made it very clear that he doesn't have any love lost for Trudeau. And Mark Carney was seen very close to Trudeau's ideology. And then when Mark Carney became the Prime Minister, his retaliatory tariffs, people thought that perhaps he's the guy, he's the tough guy who can take Trump straight on. So here, Carney's experience as the governor of Bank of Canada and the Bank of England's governor, and when the economic meltdown of 2008, Carney was very well there and he saw it well. So somebody who has economics in his background and a very strong forte of that, people thought that he's the right choice for the moment. And then somebody who had, who had this cabinet committee where they were talking to the US officials, they were talking to Donald Trump. They thought that perhaps a new leadership perhaps would have to start from scratch, from zero. Here, Carney would be perhaps more at a point of advantage when he's negotiating with Donald Trump. So I think that's where he had an edge. And rest of the issues where many thought that he's taking over from where Trudeau left for the last 8-9 years of Liberal government. He proved them wrong. He said that I am not Trudeau, I'm Mark Carney. So he sent across that message very loud and clear that he's Mark Carney, he's somebody who knows how to correct the economics of the country and take the country forward. So in his last 1 month or so, he's proved his mettle, and he was seen as a very strong leader. So many, they didn't try Pierre Poilievre. So that's where Carney had the advantage. The entire country had united. Brampton had its different issues. The Indian community had its different issues. But today, it's the question of survival. For Canada, it's the question of survival. And Donald Trump is the main threat here in Canada. So many thought that perhaps Carney is better placed. And that's the reason why there were reverses where Conservative Party till about December had almost 20. They touched 20 points lead. And today we were talking where the mainstream media is saying that Conservatives don't have an edge anymore. Rather, Liberals, they are leading by 7 to 8 points. So as the early results come in from Atlantic Canada, I think Liberals are making a point there.
Right, Vikram, thanks so much for taking us through what the hot issues are at the moment. In fact, to get in a word from Toronto, we have with us Yash Chawla joining us on the broadcast at the moment. Yash, thanks so much for making time for us. Now, we understand that affordability has been quite the crisis as far as Canada is concerned. Immigration has been one of the key issues. Take us through all the key issues in Toronto at the moment, and are we seeing any surprising tilts this time around?
Well, to be very honest, there are a lot of key issues that bug the voters this time around. You've nailed it right by calling out immigration as one of the issues, unchecked immigration, and people finding loopholes out of loopholes, and the government not plugging in, because if you the immigration is actually a federal responsibility, and they were not doing it well. So there was a whole lot of a problem with that. Plus, at the same time, inflation hit an all-time high. I'll just give you a very simple example. If you order the same items from a previous order that you did from a service like a Walmart, like 2 years ago versus now, there's a good 20-25% jump. And that's something that the people were feeling the pinch. At the same time, common people like us who go to work, there was a lot of homelessness. There was a lot of issues with the housing, because the housing market has also, in fact, crashed in the last few days. But that's a very specific Toronto problem. And as you're well aware, that most population in Canada is centric around the GTA, which is the Greater Toronto Area, and towards the west coast of Vancouver. So those were some of the big issues, and I felt that as I spoke to my friends who were also first-time voters and some of the other colleagues I've had, they're very confused. And to be honest, that means that tonight's going to be a very long night when the results keep tumbling out. But an incredible turnaround per se. The local canvassing was at its all-time high in the last couple of weeks, and there were people coming door to door. The local representatives where I live in Richmond Hill, Ontario, they were coming door to door. They were making the same kind of promises. And it's going to be an interesting night. The graphic on the screen says it. It's going to be neck to neck. What I'm also reading up online is that the Atlantic states are going to get flipped. So there might be a surprise coming in. But let's see what happens.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on any surprises coming in with you, Yash. Thanks so much for joining us with that quick update. Michael, I want to bring you in here. The pressure of sky-high rents, home prices, it seems to have created quite a voter swing in many parts. Take us through the early trends and also the key issues that have emerged for you that many may be missing at this point.
Well, I think, first of all, it is the relationship with the United States. I think what Mark Carney did was stoke the fire of fear, the big bad, the United States. Canada put itself in a position where 75% of our product, our largest consumer, is the United States. You can't cut the hand that feeds you immediately. It takes some time. I think that reciprocal tariffs that Mark Carney immediately put on was a reactionary position that he had to take to stand up so Canadians know that we're not going to be taken advantage of. But the reality is that North America, as a trading group, as a production group, Canada and the United States would be much, much stronger and would be a much more viable economy together against the world, if you wish, if there were zero tariffs back and forth. I think one of the things that Poilievre said at the very beginning, which was very emblematic of our Ontario Premier, Doug Ford, is that zero tariffs, zero on you, zero on us. The integration of the auto industry and the manufacturing in Ontario and the United States, it can affect almost 120,000 jobs in the United States and approximately 160,000 jobs in Canada. I mean, the mayor of Brampton, Patrick Brown, knows very well the Chrysler plant in Brampton and those people who depend on that plant. So I think that's first and foremost. Secondarily, Canada also has to understand that China now has said to the United States that they're going to eliminate their precious metals. The United States needs precious metals, not only for their military, but for their manufacturing.
Of course.
China had said that they are going to stop with the magnets. So there are many pieces that go into this puzzle, but I'm still hoping that the Conservatives are going to pull it out.
Well, let's wait and watch. We're keeping a close eye on all the latest developments straight out of Canada. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for making time for us. Slipping into a quick commercial break. Back in a moment with much more. Do stay tuned. Well, Canada's polls are broadly seen as the most important election in a generation. One of the world's most prosperous nations and America's closest ally and trading partner, Canada has found itself in recent months unexpectedly in the crosshairs of President Donald Trump, targeted with tariffs and annexation threats, as our reporters from across Canada and Washington have been briefing you about as well. But the country has also seen many of its coveted national accomplishments in regard to the economy and social issues slip, including higher costs of living, high unemployment, rising housing costs, and also a surge in homelessness and substance abuse. Many of these problems, not just in Canada but in other advanced economies, were actually exacerbated by the pandemic. But many Canadians blame a decade of Liberal Party rule under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for the country's woes. But what exactly are the main issues in Canada at this point? Take a look at NDTV World's report.
As Canadians head to polls, the major parties have made their final push to address some key issues. So what are they, and how are they shaping one of the most consequential elections in the country's history? One of the most important issues is the cost of living crisis, something Canada has been grappling with for years. Both the main parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, have promised tax cuts for people in the lowest tax bracket. While Liberals are offering 1 percentage point cut, their opponents have promised to lower the rate from 15 to 12.75%. The campaigns have hinged on how the next leader would handle the trade crisis with its closest economic ally, the United States. The Conservatives have vowed tax relief for workers affected by the Trump tariffs. On the other hand, the Liberals have said they would help workers and businesses with the money raised by counter tariffs. Another issue affecting millions is skyrocketing home prices. While the Liberals want to create a federal entity that would act as a developer for affordable housing, the Conservatives are aiming to build 2.3 million homes in Canada in the next 5 years. With primarily these issues in mind, Canadians will decide who leads their country through some troubled times. Vishal Vivek's report for NDTV World.
Look, I'm a very different person from Justin Trudeau.
Further clarity, joining us on the broadcast at the moment, we have with us senior journalist from the US, live from Washington, Ray Locker. Daniel Boardman joining us live from Toronto. Also have with us Randall Henson, professor of political science from the University of Toronto. And joining us in a few moments from now, we will also have ground voices from Canada. Daniel, I want to get in a word live from Toronto first. Would you say Mark Carney has successfully reframed this entire election as a referendum on resisting Donald Trump? Or is that narrative only playing among elites is what you would argue?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I think that's a decent analysis. I think Donald Trump did a better job of framing the election around Donald Trump than Mark Carney ever did. I said a couple months ago, I mean, the Canadian election is basically, who do you hate more, Justin Trudeau or Donald Trump? And neither of the two names will be on the ballot. So Trudeau's exit definitely did play well for the Liberals. There was definitely some Trudeau fatigue. Everyone was ready to get rid of him. The distaste towards Justin Trudeau over the last 10 years had sort of hit boiling point, reached a maximum. He had alienated nearly every single group that wasn't part of like his inner circle, diehard supporters. So the swap to Mark Carney worked very well for the Liberals. And Mark Carney is a very good veneer as this sort of global technocrat. And I think Mark Carney and Donald Trump are really good for each other politically. They work well as character foils to each other's bases.
Right.
So Mark Carney was basically running against Donald Trump. And you can understand in Canada when Trump's threatening to annex the country, how that could push people towards a very heavily anti-Trump view. And the Liberals in general in Canada have their form of nationalism. Canadian liberal nationalism is very anti-American. So when there's a wave of anti-Americanism, it does benefit the Liberals electorally. So that's why Carney really pulled into it. And Donald Trump seems to be kind of softly pushing Mark Carney and antagonizing people because I think Mark Carney is a much better villain for Donald Trump than Pierre Poilievre would be, because if Pierre Poilievre, who is a very well-spoken economic, small C conservative, can talk about the value of free trade and all that, if Pierre Poilievre were to go on someone like the Ben Shapiro show and be able to connect with conservative Americans and explain why the whole tariff war is ridiculous, it could really undermine Trump as people see another strong, reasonable conservative leader on the continent and can cause some problems. Whereas a Mark Carney versus Donald Trump is perfect for each other because Mark Carney fits every sort of villain stereotype that the MAGA base would need. Global banker, prince money, in Europe, loves everything diversity and climate change, all those money laundering schemes for progressive causes he's in on. If Klaus Schwab is no longer, the villain of the internet right, Mark Carney is a perfect substitute for whatever, globalist conspiracy you want. So Carney's attempt and Trump's attempt to frame this as a Donald Trump election, of course, as I think it's been the biggest boon to the Liberals. If you look at the reason why people are voting conservative, it's a split of housing, crime, education, this, and this. Anti-Trump and fears of Trump and anti-Americanism is the primary driver of the current Liberal vote, as well as the collapse of Jagmeet Singh's NDP.
Daniel, then, would you say this election is about the anti-Trump drive, economic competence, cultural survival, or simply just damage control against an uncertain American neighbor?
Yeah, this is a very strange election to say what it's about, because it's a snap election after he got rid of Trudeau with Donald Trump coming in. This is a very consequential but whirlwind election. And again, it was only 38 days, and everyone was sort of weirdly caught off guard from it when we were kind of headed towards an early election for the last year. So it's a very strange election in Canada. Whereas I think sovereignty is the number one thing, but all the parties are very much aligned. There's no party, neither the Liberals or the Conservatives are going to cede sovereignty to Donald Trump. And, if you want to get technical on it, a Liberal win, the way America would annex Canada is if Alberta were to hold a plebiscite and leave, and then decide to join the states. I mean, the loss of any of the provinces would break the country. So if the Conservatives win, I think Alberta there's no chance of Alberta leaving. If Mark Carney wins and continues the Liberals' antagonism towards the West, and the Trump administration kind of decides to learn what it's talking about when it mentions Canada and doesn't just sort of fly off the handle without any guidance, there's a scenario where they can entice a plebiscite in Alberta with 51st statehood. That is a threat to Canada here, but I mean it's very strange because it is an election kind of defined, but you base it, and as I said, this election is who do you hate more, Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau, and neither name's on the ballot.
Right. So this election, as Daniel is arguing, is about who you hate more. But the former Bank of England boss, Mark Carney, he became Canada's Prime Minister after he was sworn in last month, and now he's fighting to stay in the job after calling a snap general election, which will see Canadians pick their new leader and who is going to be up against Donald Trump and his protectionist policies. Mark Carney was actually the first non-British person to take on the top banking role in the central bank's more than 300-year history. And he had previously steered his home country through the 2008 financial crash as the governor of the Bank of Canada. But you must note this, unlike most Prime Minister hopefuls, Mark Carney has never held political office. Still, he handily won the Liberal Party contest to replace outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in early March. Now he's touting his experience handling the global economic crisis, hoping Canadians will see him as the leader most likely to stand up to Donald Trump, who has launched a trade war on his northern neighbor. Just take a look at Mark Carney and his career highlights.
Once better known in financial circles than political ones, Mark Carney is now at the centre of Canada's political future, leading the Liberal Party to become Canada's 25th Prime Minister. Carney took the baton from Justin Trudeau at a moment of political uncertainty and global tension. With President Trump's repeated threats related to trade and even annexation, Canada's defence, many now believe, could rest on Carney's shoulders. Born in the Northwest Territories, raised in Edmonton, he went on to become the governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 crisis. In 2013, he became the first non-Brit to head the Bank of England and later steering the UK through Brexit. But Carney wasn't always destined for politics. He aligned with the Liberal Party in 2021, just as Trudeau's popularity began to fall. When offered the finance minister post in 2023, he declined. This move triggered internal crisis, and within months, Trudeau stepped aside. Carney's campaign is focused on fixing the economy, shielding Canada from Trump's trade threats, and stabilizing a fractured political climate. When Trump hinted at annexing Canada, Carney's viral comeback, "We find you attractive, but we are not moving in with you," struck a chord. His international credentials give him credibility in navigating economic turbulence. But critics argue he spent more time leading foreign institutions than serving Canada. As Canada decides, whoever is the Prime Minister next will have to deal with the volatile US President, among other challenges. With Ridhima Kedia, NDTV World.
Right. For further clarity, we also have with us, live from Toronto at the moment, Professor Hansen, who's a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much, sir, for making time for us. Is this election another example of how democracy is actually being forced into choices between competence and populism? What would you argue?
Well, that's an interesting framing of it. I mean, many of the points have already been covered. Mark Carney is quite simply the luckiest man on the planet. Arguably, again, he was actually
well, his
quite
stars
lucky.
Are aligned, that's for sure.
Say that again?
His stars are definitely aligned.
Oh, yes, unquestionably. In the absence of Trump's interventions, Pierre Poilievre would be enjoying a majority by tomorrow morning. So that's the main story. But what we should also add is that the Conservatives have run a terrible campaign. They ran a campaign against someone who is no longer on the ballot, which is to say, Justin Trudeau. So the language of an attack on woke, we'll have a warrior culture, not a woke culture. This never played terribly well in Canada. it plays incredibly badly when you have Trump in the White House. And I'm not close enough to the Conservative Party to offer any insight on this, but I'm staggered that there wasn't a second envelope that said, if Trudeau is not leading the Liberal Party, and if Trump wins, this is what we're going to do. They were running a campaign which is about a year old.
Professor Hanson, are we then seeing the erosion of the traditional left versus right divide replaced by a newer stability versus disruption model of voting behavior in Canada specifically?
Well, it's complex. I mean, in some ways, we're seeing a reinforcing of the left-right divide, and that 80% of the vote looks like it's going to go to the Liberals or the Conservatives, which hasn't happened since Diefenbaker in 1958. But I understand the burden of your question. The Liberals are doing so well because there's a perception of an existential threat. We will have to see how things develop over the 2 years to see if we're watching a kind of reconfiguration of the cleavages in this country. So far, not. It looks more like the last British election, where the Labour and Conservatives sucked up most of the vote with reform sneaking in, than it does what we've seen in France or Germany or indeed the United States, where the populists have overtaken the Republican Party.
Michael, I want to bring you in here. Would you then argue this election is about economic competence or a complete anti-Trump drive, a hate campaign against Justin Trudeau, cultural survival, or simply damage control against an uncertain American neighbor?
I think the word damage control comes to light. First of all, it was the ill management of the Canadian economy, the irresponsibility of allowing debt, and the inclusion of certain liberal doctrines that were distasteful to many Canadians, particularly west of Ontario. I will say that Pierre Poilievre was elected by people, whereas Mark Carney was never elected. That's why Mark Carney could not have opened Parliament. He would not have been able to speak on the floor of the House of Commons as the Prime Minister, as he was anointed because he was given the Liberal leadership, because he did not hold a seat. So he was forced to call an election. Let's first start with that. His economic record with multiple prime ministers and European leaders, to some people, suggests that he is an elitist. He does not understand what a dozen eggs cost and how the cost of filling your tank with gas has increased to such an extent. Pierre Poilievre tried to reach those type of people and to make himself more available to the country. I also agree with one of your panel members that I think Pierre Poilievre could have ran a better campaign. At the outset, it was axe the tax. Well, what was the first thing Carney did when he got in? Stop the carbon tax. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to reinstitute it when he gets in, if he becomes the Prime Minister. But that whole leg about axe the tax, the carbon tax, okay, he just quit the tax, now what are you going to talk about? So I think Carney's motion to get rid of the tax wasn't properly followed up by Poilievre. And one final point, as with America and with many other European countries, people are now in silos. People are now being very distinct, either left or right, red or blue. The separation, there is very little middle ground or gray ground, and I think that's what we have to start to build. I mean, the Republicans are having a problem with the Democrats. Neither one of them are going to sit and listen to each other. So that polarization, that tribalism exists. And I think we have that in Canada as well, because everything west of Ontario is basically conservative. And you know what they say, Ontario determines an election and Quebec determines if it's going to be a minority or a majority.
Well, that's key there. Thanks so much, Michael. We'll be keeping a close eye on that. Ray, I want to bring you in. Ray's joining us live from Washington at the moment for the Vantage Point from the US. Ray, given Trump's tariffs and annexation threats, is Washington quietly rooting for stability over ideological kinship?
I'm not sure what the Trump administration is rooting for, but I think most people I know are rooting for a little more stability. It's almost like Mark Carney is paying Donald Trump to run his campaign, to be his foil. I mean, as the other panelists have said, Trudeau was going down the tubes fast. He quit. He had no other choice. Carney steps in. And then Trump is like throwing him a lifeline. And when Canadians look at what's happening in the United States, Trump is not popular anymore. He never was really popular, but now he's underwater on most of his major issues. Our economy is all over the place. Nobody knows what's going to happen. He changes his mind all the time. And if you're in Canada and you're voting and you're like, this guy wants to annex us, people say they don't. Mark Carney says he doesn't want to do that. I'm going to vote for that guy, regardless of what other problems I perceive out there.
Well, Ray, could Canada's political turbulence then accelerate America's own debates about things like alliances, democracy, and even the trade policy in the next Trump presidency?
Yeah, I think so.
The current policies that are going on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because the countries are so closely linked and Trump keeps sticking his hands into Canadian politics. I mean, I look at what happened earlier this month with the Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. Elon Musk was up there. Trump was backing the Republican candidate for the Supreme Court, and they lost by 10 points in a state that Trump won in November. So people are kind of backing away for some of his policies. And the election in Canada, if Carney and the Liberals pull it out, will be seen as a validation of people who are trying to resist what Trump is doing.
Right. Well, Ray, as always, thanks so much for joining us with your views. Do stay on with us as we slip into a very short commercial break, gentlemen. We're back in a moment with the latest. Do stay tuned. Well, you're tracking the detailed coverage on Canada's polls with us on NDTV. We've got a panel of experts throwing lights on all the key issues that are concerning the voters in Canada and whether Mark Carney will now be leading the nation and whether he'll be elected to do so. With us at the moment, we have Ray Locker, live from Washington, D.C., Professor Hansen, live from Toronto. Professor Hansen, I'd like to just quickly bring you in on one other aspect. Is the Canadian election another sort of example for how leaders from across the West should actually stand up to Donald Trump and his protectionist policies and transactional nature?
Well, it's a fascinating question because there's really two models out there, and you can cite some evidence in favor of both of them. Carney and Canada generally has stood up to Trump. China has done so to a superlative degree. And the British are pursuing a strategy of accommodation, if not appeasement. There are different views on this, but as far as I can judge Donald Trump, when he smells weakness, he smells blood. And what we've seen in response, above all, to China, but to a degree to Canada, when he exempted from some of the tariffs those goods that were covered by free trade acts, is that he will respond to strength. So that's a long and rather academic way of saying, yes, I think there's something to what you're suggesting.
Well, in what ways then might this outcome of this election actually redefine Canadian federalism, especially in multicultural provinces like Quebec?
Well, what I hope it will do in terms of redefining Canadian federalism is finally force us to get rid of these absurd and ludicrous provincial barriers between the country.
Right.
We have suffered for decades from a low productivity problem, which frankly the Justin Trudeau Liberals completely ignored. It's why our GDP per capita is declining. One of the easiest ways and cheaper than building infrastructure is to remove those barriers. So point one, I hope that's how federalism will change. But I think some of our biggest changes will be in foreign policy, and I could say something about those. Perhaps you want to stick with federalism for the moment.
Right. Ray, meanwhile, if Pierre Poilievre wins, do you foresee a serious disruption in the Canadian-US relationship on aspects of trade, climate, or defense?
If he wins?
Yes.
Is that your question? You know, I think there'll be some kind of adjustment. Things will be somewhat different, but I don't think he's going to roll over and do what Trump wants either. I mean, I think that would be political suicide for any Canadian politician. He might be a little more accommodationist. I think, you know, before Trump started with all the tariffs, he was seen as kind of a Canadian Trumpy figure, if not quite as extreme or mercurial.
So I think it would be somewhat of a change, but I don't think he would be like, oh, I think these tariffs are great. Let's keep doing it.
Right. Michael, meanwhile, given Donald Trump's tariffs and annexation threats, do you believe that Washington is quietly rooting for stability over ideological kinship?
With all due respect to the President of the United States, Donald Trump is a bully. You talk about annexing Canada, you talk about Canada being the 51st state, you talk about Governor Trudeau. All those are little jabs to see how far you can go. I think Canada respected Mark Carney standing up and saying we will not address that. I was in Charlevoix, Quebec for the G7 ministers meeting there, where their finance ministers were there. And the thing that came across when I was speaking to many international global representatives was the shock of Donald Trump even saying the fact that he was going to annex Canada. I think once Canada finds a prime minister that will be elected at the end of this evening, that person should go down to Mar-a-Lago and have a tete-a-tete and work this out immediately, because it's harming people on both sides of the border. And I think Donald Trump respects someone who stands up to him, and I think he did respect Mark Carney. I was disappointed that Pierre Poilievre did not take an airplane flight down to Mar-a-Lago on his own initiative, and at least have a chat. But I think Donald Trump respects strength, and he knows very well that Canada has some strings that they could pull to make life in America a little more difficult than it already is. I agree with my colleague on the panel. I mean, currently he's underwater in popularity, but like every politician, you do all the cutting and the hurting and the inoculation of the patient at the very beginning. So as your term goes on, things get better. So I think things will get better, and I think once we resolve who's going to lead this country, it's also going to put us in a better negotiating state.
Right. Professor Hanson, meanwhile, I want to touch upon a separate aspect we haven't spoken about yet. How much does Canada's parliamentary system insulate it or expose it to the global wave of strongman politics?
The global wave of?
A global wave of strongman politics.
Oh, right. Well, yes, I mean, I'm slightly more optimistic on this point than my colleagues. The country is more divided than it should be. There is bitterness in Western Canada, where I come from, although that's nothing new. It was far worse during the years of the National Energy Program. But we are not in a situation that France is in, where election after election after election, the neo-fascists are coming close to the presidency. And we're not in the situation of Germany, where 24% want to vote for a country that will take Germany out of the European Union. And we're not in a situation in which the leader of this country is hell-bent on dismantling democracy and starting conflicts with all its allies. Neither candidate is actually a strong man, frankly. And so I don't think we are in that space. And to some degree, the disaster that is the Trump presidency will inoculate us against that. But I think there are cultural breaks on that in this country anyway.
Right. Michael, meanwhile, I know that the Conservatives have rallied against the cost of living crisis. Justin Trudeau's name has been propped up as far as how Canada has been shambles, has been related to his reign. But do the Conservatives have specific policies to solve the cost of living crisis in Canada? Or is their solution more, we're not the Liberals?
Well, I think Mark Carney was late in publishing his platform. I think when the housing topic came up, the Liberals started talking about cutting taxes and federal taxes, and Poilievre came up and said that he wanted to get rid of, I believe it was the HST. So they're all moving and trying to reduce taxes. Also, I would note that Carney axed the inheritance tax because he saw that as being a detrimental thing to his party. So between the Trudeau's carbon tax and the inheritance tax, Those were two things that were very distasteful. Those were things that Poilievre and the Conservatives would never have instituted. I think one of the other points, too, is Poilievre's campaign has talked about cutting the cost of government, making things smarter and more efficient, whereas I think some of the initiatives that Mark Carney was presenting was increasing the deficit and thinking, we come back to that kitchen table aspect, when at the end of the month you're short $1,000, you don't go another $1,000 in debt to be $2,000 in debt and
Right.
think that it's going to solve your problem. So I think this is kind of like the inoculation syndrome that's happening, which is what America is going through now.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us with your views on NDTV. Canada's polls are broadly seen as the most important election in a generation. One of the world's most prosperous nations and America's closest ally and trading partner, Canada has found itself in recent months unexpectedly in the crosshairs of US President Donald Trump, targeted with tariffs and annexation threats. But the country, you must note, has also seen many of its national accomplishments in regard to the economy, social issues slip, including higher costs of living, as we've discussed, high unemployment, rising housing costs, as well as a surge in homelessness and substance abuse. Many of these problems, not just in Canada, but in other advanced economies as well, were actually exacerbated by the pandemic, but many Canadians blame a decade of Liberal Party rule under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for the country's woes. Now, will Canada turn the tide? Well, we'll be tracking all the latest key developments for you right here on NDTV. Slipping into a very quick break for now. Back in a moment. Do stay tuned.